So my name is Flora Lucero, Chair of the Democratic Party of Bernalillo County. We sure appreciate you joining us tonight. Manny will be hosting this webinar, and I will turn it over to him at this time.
Stay within the time frame that you allotted me, and probably even give you more back, so that we can have all of our educators tonight address some of the issues that are affecting the African American community. And we appreciate having this joint meeting with you tonight every single time, because we like working together in a collaborative forum. So thank you very much, and I'll sit back and get ready to listen.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here with you on this evening. It's an exciting evening. I hope you have your popcorn and something to drink, because they're going to have a lot of fun here today. I would like to start. My name is Diane Torres Velasquez. I will briefly introduce myself. I am the ward chair for 27A, and I am a professor at the University of New Mexico in the College of Education and Human Sciences. I am also the president of the Latino Education Task Force, which is the group that worked with legislators to create the Hispanic Education Act in 2010. And it is also the group that started and created and worked with MALDEF on the Martinez and Yazi versus State of New Mexico lawsuits. And so I am excited and honored to be here with you in this panel. And I want to tell you that we have some incredible people on our panel this evening. These are people who really have shifted how we view public education and how we view education for students in what we would call at-risk categories in the lawsuit, but for our students who are underrepresented in public schools, in students of color. I'm going to briefly introduce them each. And let's see if I can pull this up, and let's see if my computer will cooperate. So first, I would like to introduce Representative Christine Trujillo. Representative Trujillo lives in Albuquerque with her husband, Dale Petty. They have 5 children and 7 grandchildren. She was born and raised in Taos, New Mexico, and has 15 brothers and sisters. 11 of them are still alive. Her father was a land grant recipient of Piedras Lumbres and Conejos land grants, and her mother was from Colfax County. She traces her family back to the late 17th century in New Mexico. She is an active Democrat, as you all know, and former National Committee woman at large, appointed by Governor Howard Dean and reappointed by Governor Tim Kaine. She has served 3 two-year terms in the New Mexico House, representing the New Mexico's 25th district. She serves at this time, and for the last year or two, she has served as the New Mexico House Education, in the New Mexico House Education Committee and the House Appropriations Committee during the legislative session. She is chair of the very powerful Legislative Education Study Committee, the LESC, that creates the policies and regulations for our children in New Mexico. And she also serves on the Legislative Health and Human Services Committee, Courts and Corrections Committee, Land Grant Committee during the interim. I have a list here of 1,000 awards she has won and all kinds of service she has provided. And we could be here all night, but I won't do that. I'm going to move on because I think most of us know Representative Trujillo as a real champion, as a real advocate for all of our children in New Mexico. Ernest Herrera is a staff attorney with the American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Based in MALDEF's Western Regional Office at this time, he's based in Los Angeles, California, and formerly based in the Southwest Regional Office in San Antonio, Texas, where he specializes in voting rights, litigation, educational equity, and immigrants' rights cases. Mr. Herrera has worked on a number of successful cases in the area of voting rights, including Perez versus Abbott, in which the U.S. Supreme Court in 2018 ruled in favor of MALDEF's unique claim of racial gerrymandering in Texas State House Redistricting Plan, and Patiño versus City of Pasadena, the first case to secure contested Section 5 bail-in after Shelby County versus Holder. He also worked on the challenge to the January 2019 Texas voter purge, in which the state of Texas challenged the voter registration of close to 100,000 registered voters, most of whom are naturalized US citizens. In the area of education, he has worked on the enforcement of a desegregation consent decree in Morales versus Uvalde Consolidated Independent School District, and is a member of the team that litigates the Martinez versus New Mexico school finance case. Currently, he is working on a lawsuit in Alabama in which they're fighting a lawsuit by the state of Alabama to exclude undocumented immigrants from the population base used for apportioning congressional districts. He's also worked on lawsuit fighting collaboration of the city of Las Vegas with ICE to detain undocumented immigrants unconstitutionally. Thank you, Mr. Herrera. Dean Hansel Burley has led the UNM College of Education and Human Sciences since July 1st, 2020. He was most recently chair of the Educational Psychology and Leadership Department at Texas Tech University, which was the university's largest graduate department. The department has 6 programs: instructional technology, educational psychology, special education, educational leadership, higher education, and counselor education. He has also served as Associate Dean for Undergraduate Education, Associate Dean for Graduate Education, Associate Dean for Academics and Data for over 10 years in Higher Education Administration. He is also a professor of educational psychology at TTU. He is widely published on institutional research topics and issues surrounding diversity and students' abilities to access and succeed in higher education. And I just want to take a moment to say, Dean Burley, we are so glad to have you as our Dean at the College of Education and Human Sciences. Welcome to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and to UNM. Dr. Irene Vasquez is the chair of Chicana and Chicano Studies Department at the University of New Mexico. She also serves as the director of the Southwest Hispanic Research Center. Under her leadership and with the support of the faculty, students, and staff, and community, UNM established a Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies, a bachelor's degree, an online bachelor's degree, and a graduate studies certificate in Chicana and Chicano Studies. In fall 2019, the UNM Regents voted to approve a master's and a PhD program in Chicana and Chicano Studies, and that is historic. Currently, she directs the college preparation programs that seek to immerse dual enrollment ethnic studies courses into high school classrooms in New Mexico. Ronalda Talmuarito is an experienced advocate, education consultant with a 20-year track record supporting and working for Native American families and their children with disabilities. As an advocate, her goals include finding the balance in any situation, seeking solutions and making parents feel understood, seeing education from an imbalance to a balanced system has been her focus for years. National Indian Education Association, New Mexico IDEA panel, and New Mexico Committee on Civil Rights are a few of the boards and committees on which she has participated. She is in the process of completing her graduate program in race and social justice at the University of New Mexico and has her BA in liberal arts with emphasis in special education. Robert Corkey Frosto was born in Eagle Pass, Texas, and moved to New Mexico 31 years ago. He is an artist and an educator. He hosts an annual community-based art and music festival at his home in the South Valley. He has taught at Highland High School for 21 years. Most recently, he's been teaching Mexican American Studies, Mexican American Literature, and Psychology. Corkey is a graduate student at UNM working on his PhD in Chicano and Chicano Studies. His research is focused on the effects of ethnic studies classes on at-risk youth, and he is one of the teachers who works in the dual credit program between Albuquerque Public Schools and the University of New Mexico in Chicana and Chicano Studies. Welcome, everyone. And Christian, Perez is a student at Highland High School who has been working with Corkey Frosto over the years on Mexican American studies in education. He is a member of the community who speaks for the youth and speaks on behalf of high school students in our region. Thank you so much for joining us, Christian. I am going to ask something of you and of the audience. And I'm doing this in order to generate questions from our audience because it's my understanding that even though I get to ask you some questions as the facilitator, we're going to get questions from the audience as well. And so to prompt that discussion, I would like to ask you the same question that I'm going to ask them. And that is, when you see racial equity, what does it look like? Now, in order to answer that question, you also have to think of the opposite. If you're thinking racial equity in concrete terms, what does racism in education look like as well? So you might want to take a sheet of paper if you have one with you, or you might want to mentally note. And on one side, just some concrete vision of something you've seen in terms of racism in education, but some concrete vision in terms of racial equity in education. One of the things that we got feedback on as we were preparing for this is that many of us have heard some of the stories, and we know what we see, and we heard from Manny and from our chair of the Democratic Party, the racial inequities that we're experiencing and the education equities that we're experiencing. And the idea is that if we can get them into concrete form, maybe we can come up with some solutions tonight as well as we are listening to you and hearing from this panel. Some of us this week were invited to the LESC meeting by Representative Trujillo and her Legislative Education Study Committee, and we got the chance to talk a little bit about special education. And tonight, special education certainly fits in racial education as well. And so please, when we're looking at racial equity, let's see what we can do to move the conversation. So what does racial equity look like? Let's hold on to that for a minute. For the audience, maybe you can answer that. I know this is coming through on Facebook, so maybe you could answer that on the Facebook link. What does racial equity look like? You can just enter your thoughts on racial equity and what it looks like. And then Manny, I think you are going to help us to get some of the questions through. So that would be fantastic. But before we start with those, I want us to take a step back and all of us to reflect. We have an amazing panel. And when you listen to their accomplishments, wow, it's incredible, all the things that people on this panel have done. And I'm just wondering if y'all would take a moment to share with us a short story, maybe a couple of minutes, just a short story about someone in your family or someone in your past who influenced you, who inspired you to be such a strong advocate for racial equity in education. And I'm wondering if there's anyone that would like to go first. Dr. Vasquez.
I think Corkey put his hand up if you want to go first.
Oh, I didn't see it. I was looking down.
It's okay.
Corkey, please.
I think that for me, that when I was first inspired to start dealing with issues in education was in 1968 in South Texas along the Rio Grande Valley, when students started walking out of schools. And that was when I met Willie Velasquez and Jose Angel Gutierrez and those people.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
And those were the ones that kind of like, okay, this is time. Let's go out and walk. Let's go out and march. And it was 1969 that I participated in my first march. And it
Wow.
was dealing with integrating the schools and getting rid of the inequities in South Texas at the time.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
I'll go ahead and share.
Thank you, Dean Burley.
Yes, my parents, and of course, I had a college professor that was very influential. And my parents were educators in the 1960s. They taught in segregated schools. And then my father was the first African-American principal to supervise white teachers, really in a large swath of East Texas. I'm a Texan, born and bred. And my mother was the first, one of two of the first African-American teachers at an all-white high school. So this was 1968. 1968 was quite a year, wasn't it? And they went through quite a bit. However, they handled it really well, and the way they handled it, it led to my little small hometown in East Texas actually naming a school for my parents. So that was a pretty cool ultimate outcome of that. And then I had a professor in college. He happened to be Jewish, but he was really my first academic to expose me to the importance of culture and culturally relevant pedagogy and various literatures and different ways of looking at the world. And that was just a great experience. We still communicate at least once a year.
Wow, that's powerful. Dr. Vasquez.
Well, I mean, in response to the question, I have been very influenced by my mother. I know you probably can't see this picture, but
oh yes,
she was born in Coahuila in northern Mexico, and so as a child, my siblings and I attended a school that was predominantly white, and we would openly be called, wetbacks and beaners. My brother, whose father is Warm Springs Apache, would be referred to by the N-word. And so we had grown up in this kind of context of very overt racism. But one memory I remember of my mother, who's very of small stature. I was in the 6th grade, and I had been kicked off a trip for actually putting my middle finger up at a boy who was always harassing me and pulling my hair. And I just remember she went right up, she didn't make an appointment. She just charged through the door, and the school was one where you could pretty much hear, loud voices from one end of the school to the other. And she really laid into that principle and in Spanish, and called her a racist. And I remember thinking, being in a way a little bit alarmed by it, but those memories of her fighting back all the time in her native language, in fairly large crowds of people, has always stuck with me. And even though my personality tends to be much more introverted in a certain way, I get that tenacity from her.
Thank you for sharing that. And especially that piece about tenacity, naming what it was that drove her there. Thank you. Christian, please.
Hello. I think the person for me that inspired me the most would be Mr. Corkey Frosto, because when I was taking the class, I was also a member of Metro, and in that, in those meetings, and I would start to see how the inequalities, and Frosto for me was the only person I really knew in person that was there in the protest back in the day, and even to this day. I remember we would go to marches and walks, and it was a good experience. And he was the first person to really show me someone from my community doing that.
Thank you, Christian. You are definitely the next generation, and we very much appreciate you. Thank you. Ronalda.
I know some of you probably heard my story before, but I'm particularly influenced by the generations of my great-great-grandmother and my grandmothers and my mother. In 1863, my great-great-grandmother, Maria Beta, walked the long walk of the Navajos. And she was only 7 years old and trekked all the way from Window Rock, Arizona to Fort Sumner, and then lost her family there and trekked all the way back and was taken care by a soldier the duration of that walk, but then was adopted by an aunt or uncle. What killed her was the 1918 influenza. And we're looking at that now with this whole pandemic. My grandmother lost both of her parents through that pandemic and was raised by aunts and uncles. And what my mother at 6 years old received a knock on her door. Then the missionaries came and took her and put her in a Christian boarding school, which is now known as Rehoboth in Gallup, New Mexico. And then my whole duration of life ended up growing up on the Navajo reservation on the eastern part of Navajo. But my whole, watching my mother work for the Bureau of Indian Affairs really showed me, the racial disparities for someone who didn't have an education, but really tried hard to sustain not only justice, but found that when she would speak out and have a voice, she had the choice of either keeping her job, getting fired, or just being silent. And so through the course of that, I've come to realize not only when I needed help in public school, there was one particular incident my mother helped me, even though she was very busy and could never find the time to be part of our education, that her work and her help for advocating for me when our principal tried to stop our prom. And I never realized the amount of injustices that were occurring in numerous schools that are on the reservation. But it became more prominent as I became an advocate and then started looking at my own children within the school system. And not only have those things gone away, they're very prominent more so now. We just know how to name them and what to call them now. But so my work generated not only from my mother, but it was really understanding the racial injustices, the laws and policies that enslaved so many of our people. And we don't stop to think about the traumas associated with those particular injustices and the lack of not reading and writing. What kind of traumas do we put on our children? And so that has been my quest in all of this, because I think that we don't see the disparities, we don't see the imbalances, because my other big title here is healer. It's a generational gift that I've been given through my family. And so I take that on to look at imbalances within education. But my grandmothers and my mother have been very strong in why I do the work I do. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronalda. That is very powerful. I so appreciate you sharing the story with us and making the connection to the injustices that still exist today and the labels that we give them, and yet we can't get them to stop. Thank you. Ernest?
I think Representative Trujillo, I don't.
Oh, okay. I was looking on the other side of the screen. Go ahead, Representative Trujillo, please.
Yes, thank you very much. The influences for me have been my parents. You read a little bit about my bio. I come from a very large northern New Mexico family, and they were land grant and
Okay, somehow you've been muted, and I'm thinking we may have some technical difficulties there, Representative Trujillo.
Can I try it again?
Try that again. Yes, please.
Okay, I was saying that my family were land grant recipients, and so they were raised speaking Spanish, and living up in Taos, it's very, very rural, very the typical stuff that you read about. And so we were raised speaking Spanish for a long time. But my dad was the person who really, really tried to ensure that we continue to speak Spanish. There would be arguments about, no, we have to learn English, that's the way of the future, and so on and so forth. My dad always said, no pierdan su idioma. You need to make sure that you continue to learn your language and respect your culture. And he did that. And, I'm a high school dropout. I didn't finish school. I eventually went back and got an MA, of course, but and in bilingual education. But the reality is that through the process of my personal evolution, I was really influenced. I went back to Taos eventually, and the people who influenced my role as a bilingual educator, along with my dad, were Dr. Leonila Serna. I don't know if you all remember who she was. Dr. Euclides Tenorio, Francis Quintana, Roy Martinez. They were really pioneers in Taos with federal programs when we first started getting information about and funding for bilingual education. And then my great-great-grandfather was Antonio Faustin Trujillo, and he was the sheriff of Taos County many, many years ago. But he, in terms of tenacity and spirit, I think that he and the people around him in my family, I think I inherited their political attributes in terms of getting everything together and influencing my life, because you can't beat your head against the wall and expect change. You have to go out there and make that change, and that's why I've been involved the way I've been involved. Thank you.
It's amazing.
Thank you. Yes, Manny.
And
Or Ernest, sorry.
Oh, sorry. So I'm from San Antonio originally, Texas, and my inspiration was my mother. She was for I think 30 years. Yeah, about 30 years. She was a teacher in public elementary schools in Edgewood Independent School District, or Edgewood in San Antonio, who you may have heard of, and in Northside ISD, which is kind of a huge district which spans some of the wealthier areas and then some of the less socioeconomically fortunate areas in San Antonio. And her whole career is an inspiration to me because she grew up in the Edgewood district area in San Antonio, but was fortunate enough to go to Catholic school, but went and worked with students who on special education and as a math specialist for her whole career. And so her whole career to me was an inspiration because of working with mostly Latino and African American students in Northwest and West side of San Antonio. And then just it kind of worked out because I didn't really keep her apprised of what was happening where I was applying for jobs after law school. So after I was at UNM, after being at UNM and working a little bit in New Mexico, I applied to MALDEF, and then I got a job with MALDEF, and my mom was like, "Oh, MALDEF, I remember them." I had to call MALDEF when my principal at my school in Northside ISD was not letting, trying to keep undocumented students and immigrants, children out of our school, which, as some of you may know from the Plyler v. Doe MALDEF case, one of our big cases that went up to the Supreme Court, is that all children K through 12 are allowed to go to school. It doesn't matter their immigration status. So kind of came full circle. I had no idea. My mom had never told me that story. So
that's amazing.
She got to do things in her community that maybe her parents didn't get to do, and now I got to work on behalf of my community and other communities like in New Mexico for Latino students. So she was my inspiration.
Thank you so much, Ernest. Thank you for sharing that. Tenacity, spirit. I love the quote about you have to go out there and make that change. and the connection. To me, Ernest, that's a perfect example of spirit and that full circle piece and things that we don't have any control of, but yet here we are, and here you are, a MALDEF attorney, and she had called them earlier in her career, not knowing you were going to become a MALDEF attorney. That's amazing. That's truly amazing. Thank you, everyone. Is there anyone that I missed that I should be asking questions of here? All right. So we have some interesting on the chat. We have some interesting pieces. Oh, look at that, Aleli Colon. Good to see you. So glad you're with us. Brian Colon as well. Thank you, thank you. Yes, Christine Trujillo has inspired so many people. I can't even begin. I mean, the list is endless. So what I want to jump to right now is the piece about racial equity and racism. And so I'm going to read something from Jay Wilson. And Jay writes, to me, racial equity in education comes in the form of widening the options and avenues for upwards mobility and educational achievement, regardless of a student's race, ethnicity, geography, class, or physical ability. Wow. I'm wondering if I could ask for Dr. Vasquez to respond to that and to respond to the question asked earlier on racial equity.
Well, I would generally agree with that quote. I think it's amplifying, right, the experiences, content, curriculum, subjects for educational institutions. We need to be more inclusive. I think that in terms of racial equity, our first acknowledgement is that K through 12 institutions and higher education institutions are racialized. If we use the example of UNM, right, and we look at the structure of the university, who is in leadership roles, who are faculty, who are our staff and our students, we could make a case for racial inequity, right? Because as you move through the institution, and it is a hierarchical institution, you see, communities of color, right, being represented in those segments of the university. And so I think we have to start with that premise, if we're looking at ourselves in New Mexico. But a racial inequity, right, in education would look like a hierarchical institution, an institution that is exclusive, right? And exclusivity takes different forms, admission criteria, tuition and fees, and so we have to first acknowledge that, right? That racial inequity exists. If we move towards racial equity, right? And I would draw on some of what you read from that quote, but we would also see the centering and visibility, right, of communities of color in all aspects of the university, right? From curriculum to pedagogy, to content, to personnel. It would also be a place that would promote access and equity throughout the institution. And it would very importantly respond to the particular needs of our students, and I would say even our local students, right? All students, but we have to understand the space in which our university operates and the unique needs of the people of New Mexico. So I think there are some principles and some steps that we can begin to take, and I know I'm specifically speaking at UNM, that would make a difference, that would move us along a path toward racial equity. Thank you. You're
Diane, just
muted.
unmute really quick, Diane.
I knew I would do that at least once tonight. Thank you. Now that's done. All right. Thank you, Dr. Vasquez. That is wonderful. And I appreciate when we look at things through a critical lens, and you certainly do that very well. I'm wondering, Ronaldo, would you like to follow up on that, since you are, I believe you are still a student at UNM finishing up your graduate certificate in racial, tell us about your certificate. The name of it.
The graduate certificate in race and social justice.
Thank you.
I always try to simplify these definitions because it's one of these things when in addressing academia world, it's one definition, but then when you get back to the grassroots people, it's how would you identify that to a grandma sitting in Navajo, or a family that doesn't understand but sees the pain of all of this. And oftentimes I just have to try and tell them their feelings, the abuse, and all of these things that are going on within, how the system in itself keeps you in a box. And sometimes we don't know that we're in the box until we start questioning the box. And then we figure out, oh, they want to keep us inside of it. So retaliation, any way to keep you within that box. The structure of institutions is when you start to realize through your own thinking that something here isn't right. And so, and then how do you relate that through the emotions of those feelings and what you're going through? Because I think so many of our families live through trauma, and the quest for trying to figure out, and I knew, and after taking my race and social justice program, I realized, as being Dene and Navajo, all my life, I was told I was the problem. After taking the classes, I finally realized I am not the problem. It's the system out there that has created that. So I have to identify with who I am, so I become stronger and resonating with some of these facts that people try to throw at me, whether it's stereotypes, whether it's discrimination, because every day, all of us who are of color, we face those issues every day. And some people want to tell us they're illusions, they're not there, but I'm like, I'm not the problem anymore. So I guess that's how I would state it.
Corkey, I'm wondering if I could go to you also as a doctoral student at UNM in Chicano and Chicano Studies. What are some of the things that you have really benefited from in your doctoral program that you have experienced?
Well, I think the support from Dr. Vasquez and, her work in creating that program and then expanding it to the high schools and being kind of proactive in expanding it to the high schools. And that's been an important part, because I never would have joined the program if those steps hadn't happened first, and me realizing, oh, there's a place for me here, and that's important. And then the cohort and the other students in the cohort that I'm working with, and that group, we all support each other, and I'm kind of like the oldest one in that bunch. And so getting those new ideas, I'm kind of still thinking in some ways back in the 60s and 70s in terms of activism. And these students are coming up and with different ideas and different ways of addressing issues that we've been butting our heads against the wall for years.
Christian, I want to go to you now. One of the things I continue to hear about ethnic studies is that students say ethnic studies saved lives. Ethnic studies saved my life. Ethnic studies helped me at a time to connect with the world around me in a very different way than what I knew before. Can you talk to us about some of the things that you have received in learning about Chicana and Mexican American studies?
Yeah, so I would say one of the biggest things I guess gained from attending classes of that sort is more confidence within me and like being proud of my heritage, because growing up as well, like I would speak to my mother at the grocery store or something, and you'd always get those looks because like she didn't really speak English at the time. She's developed a little bit, but still like you'll speak Spanish at the store and then people give you like dirty looks or they'll tell you their comments and their opinions. And growing up, I really wasn't proud of my heritage as I am now. And I didn't really see my whole culture as like something deeper and more beautiful. And once I started taking those classes and I realized that, you know, like everyone has their own culture and they're all unique in their own ways and we should all be proud of where we come from, especially how our culture has been in these areas like California, New Mexico, Texas, like for centuries. And sometimes I still feel like we're ridiculed in a way.
I hear that from my students as well at all levels. Often they hear things are told to them that make them feel less than human, and that's not okay. And
No, not at all.
Thank you. So I know that we are also starting to get into the question of racial equity that I had posed at the beginning in terms of what are some things that you see that would create racial equity. We've heard some things already that would create that racial equity in education. And I'm wondering if anyone else would like to add to that at this point. Ronalda?
I know I mentioned this at the LEC meeting, but I think one thing that we seriously have to look at is the digital divide that we're creating with internet and internet access. For one is trying to identify, do all our children have access to internet? But I think what we're also placating here with is recognizing that public education during this time of COVID is no longer free. Every child needs to find a way to pay for internet access. Their parents have to work, probably put internet and food on the table. So it's one of these things to strongly consider. How is public education right now changing before our eyes? And do we really realize what's going on here? Because I hear about children all over Indian, you know, not only Indian country, but those who are of color who can't afford to have internet. I have a family in Laguna, a grandparent who has kids coming to his house. They are hungry, but they have no internet, so they stay there all day long just to get on the internet so that they can do their education. And then the lack of this, you know, how strong is the internet they're receiving. Some of them are just using phones. And then those who do want to go to school, we have to also recognize they're the ones that aren't getting internet. So they need a place to go to find that internet. So something just to consider right now is how much we have to pay for public education just to get internet. So is education free anymore? And are we creating the great divide between poor and rich kids? And what does that cost? Because we have to really question ourselves. We're at a juncture right now, and we have to really consider what are we doing to create the steps so that all children have access to education, to internet. And it also starts with knowing who are those kids? Because I think the data that we get, we need to now consider where are those kids that are not being serviced, and are we going to be able to access them to internet and the equipment they need? I'm just throwing that out there.
I think that's very important. Representative Trujillo.
Those are all very, very valid questions. Yesterday morning, we had, during the LESC, we had several speakers representing internet companies, telecommunications companies, talking about how the state of New Mexico can address these very inequitable situations. And it was probably a 2.5 to 3 hour conversation, and some very hard questions were asked about connectivity, the amount of physical space that New Mexico encompasses, and what we needed to ensure that little kids are not being trucked somewhere where there's a hot spot, right? And sitting on cold, bare pieces of concrete and trying to access the connection so that they can do their homework on a Chromebook. Because even though school districts were allotted COVID money to ensure that these kids had certain pieces of equipment, the dilemma is working from home, obviously. If you don't have access to connectivity, you can't get that work done. And so the legislature is really trying very hard to find a way to address that situation. We did record that. All our LESC presentations are recorded and accessible, and you may want to visit the website at LESC to ensure that you can receive the information. There were quite a few presenters that were able to talk to us, but people are coming up with ideas like blimps that will carry a signal to ensure that at least for a certain part of the day there will be accessibility, figuring how to ensure that land, wherever you have land connectivity, that there will be access signals available for kids to get that. But the goal is not to have, at least for me, in terms of equity, we should not be having to truck kids out or bus kids out, but to 7-Eleven or somewhere where they all sit in small groups trying to do their homework. It's just not justifiable. And hopefully we can move that forward. But be assured that at LESC, you all and many constituents are bringing those issues to the forefront. It isn't easy to answer. A lot of these things aren't easy to answer because this is a whole new frontier, right? So what we need to do is make sure that we're receiving information, and if you have ideas, send them over to us. We will try to address them. I know that Senator Linda Lopez is online, and she was dealing with the very same things. Both she and I are currently working from home because we also help, and I think this is important for Ronalda because she addressed it at some point when we're dealing with special ed and equity with special ed. But we're also dealing with trying to help kids who are at home being helped and overseen by grandparents because their parents are at work. So kids are trying to figure out, if they actually got access to daycare, those kids are being overseen by daycare center workers. And otherwise they're being overseen by caregivers that are grandparents who have no clue how to work on these issues. So connectivity isn't just about the actual connection, but how do you get someone who is totally unfamiliar with the use of a Chromebook and connectivity and all the programs and the jargon, right? There's iLesson and iMath and Seesaw and all those other things, and parents are trying to figure out how to help their kids ensure that they're getting the best access to education that they can in this particular era. So there's a lot of work, and we're still moving forward on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Trujillo. You actually answered the next question I was going to ask you about how important is it that you be able to reach out and bring us in to speak at your LESC meetings and that you hear from the public. And so I noticed that Brian Colon, thank you, State Treasurer Brian Colon, added the website for the video presentation that you were referring to. And so how does the general public, Representative Trujillo, how do they send you suggestions on things that need to be done for public education? Because you all are the House, the Senate combined, and some at-large members, and you know education best across the state. What does a person do if they'd like to share something with you?
Well, as you stated earlier, we all represent a certain district in the state. The Senate has their districts and the House has their districts. and our constituents are obviously are the connect, you know, they know how to connect with us. They can look at the legislative website, and our phone numbers and contact information are there. And for me, you know, I have a cell phone. I don't have a landline. So it's pretty public, 505-235-8783. And folks call me all the time, or they email me, or they talk to me in some capacity. They'll call the legislature and I get forwarded information. But that's how we all communicate. And remember that we're not a paid legislature. And so we don't have office staffs and we don't have offices. Our homes are our offices. So I think that's been a very difficult piece of information for the public to understand. Nobody answers our phones. We answer our own phones. We do all our outreach on our own. So when you call us, we're probably we are the only state that doesn't have the support systems in place, except during the session, to interact with the public through liaisons. We actually are our own contact. So just call us. We are available and we will work with you.
Thank you so very much, Representative Trujillo. I want to jump to another question that came in from Nellie Almasan. And that question is this: how do we begin to fix systemic racism and oppression involving housing, education, transportation, and property taxes? And how do we educators instill value in children from vulnerable communities that may not necessarily be shown love and value? I'm wondering, this kind of sounds like also a teacher preparation question in terms of what are we doing to prepare teachers to recognize the assets that our students bring to our classrooms, and also to recognize that racism exists, and how do we address it as teachers. And so there are a couple of people I want to be sure to ask. So I want to, and either one can start first. I want to hear from Dean Burley, and I also want to hear from Ernest Herrera, and I also want to hear from Christian Perez on this one, because you know, the lawsuit was really important. We didn't necessarily have racism as an allegation, but there are some things in that lawsuit that point to racism and anti-racist education, especially at this time. And then with Dean Burley, you are the dean of a college that prepares professionals in many departments to work with families and with children. And Christian, you are freshly in still this experience as a student, and you see things that we don't see. So I'm wondering who would like to go first.
I'll go ahead and get in there. Thank you very much. This has been a fantastic panel. Exactly what I need, being new to New Mexico, and a lot of the problems that you see here. The racism question is a huge one, and I will go to an answer based on my experience and one that I've used for many, many years. It's never going to go away. You know, racism is really a part of the culture of this country, right down to the Constitution. And if you read the Constitution, the original version, you'll know that it's imprinted with racism. Much of the history of this country is imprinted with racism. One of the ways to get around that, though, is with truth and telling all sides of the story, the 360 sides of the story. And that's one of the things I think that's happening now, that we see happening in the country. And we see much more of that. And that's a part of, that's a lead into, in preparation of teachers, is teachers need to know the full truth about the students with whom they're going to work. And as those folks who are preparing those teachers, we've got to be real honest with ourselves too. When we're taking a look at who's coming into education, if you take a look at undergraduates in teacher preparation, a lot of times we're talking about 80, sometimes 90% young white women. And so we've got to work from that perspective and in helping to change a lot of the ideas that they have about the children that they're going to be working with, who are going to be majority minority. And so that's honestly a task. We certainly need to work on knowledge, and it's something we need to do as a country. We also need to work on dispositions. You know, based upon the knowledge that you have, we want to make sure that you're going to be disposed to behave in ways that are pro-student, in ways that will help the student. When I'm talking about that is you're going to set up your classroom in a way that's going to be pro-student and pro that student's culture. You're going to speak to students in a way that's pro that student, and you're going to have rules in your classroom that's pro that student. So that, you know, that's what I get at dispositions. And one of the things that I hope that we can do even more of at UNM is to focus on competencies. And these are skills that folks, if you're working with any type of child, you should be competent enough. You should have the skill set. You should have techniques and just ways of problem solving problems for children in a repertoire that you can actually apply. So I think that's you know, trying to get at both of those really big questions at the same time. Those are some of the things that we can do. It really begins so much at the teacher level, and then we have to work and work. There will be no end to the work, I think.
And Dr. Burley, Dean Burley, we at UNM and the College of Education and Human Sciences are going to be going through accreditation sometime soon. Even though we are in COVID, we know we were preparing to go through that accreditation before COVID. And our accrediting is going to be going through the CAPE standards. And I'm wondering if you could share just a little bit about what does CAPE say about racial equity in education, or the dispositions of a teacher and the health of a child?
Yeah, you know, there are sets of competencies that are standards, if you will, that we have to have in our classes. And CAPE is an organization, I can't recall right now what it actually stands for, Council for the Accreditation of
Educator,
something. Yeah.
education
Right.
Preparation or something like that, yes.
Right. And but they set these standards for the knowledge base that the teachers ought to have, and they also set the standards for you know, dispositions. And when they're setting the standards, that means that this is the way we should be teaching folks, and this is the way that we should be evaluating these folks who are in our classes. And basically, we shouldn't let them out. We should not let them work with children unless they have these sets of competencies. And then even above that, the skill sets. And so there's an expectation that our teachers have knowledge, skills, and of course dispositions toward what's called culturally relevant pedagogy. And there's plenty of research out there for that particular approach to teaching diverse students and also teaching students who are different from yourself. So just a whole set of skills and a large knowledge base there that those teachers would have to have. Not sure if I answered your question. I kind of got lost there.
Well, there's a lot of information there. Thank you so very much. There's a message here from Patricia Salisbury. Dean Burley, welcome to Albuquerque and UNM. How many minority students are enrolled and working toward education degrees? Now, we didn't ask you to prepare for this, so we'll have to look into it and get back to Patricia Salisbury with the exact data, because we do have that data. How many African-American students, obviously something very important here, and does APS recruit teachers from HCBUs? So we'll probably need to get back to Patricia Salisbury on that information. Ernest, would you mind talking a little bit about the lawsuit and a little bit about the question of racial equity and teachers?
Not at all. So First of all, I think there were a couple of questions one from Han and one from Kelly McCloskey
There we go.
Romero.
Yes, thank you.
That were left. So really quickly, I know they've been sitting there for a few minutes.
Yes, thank you.
One of them from Han, I would defer to the people on the ground in the districts about what is best. It's probably best to whatever's safest in your area, I would imagine, but I would defer to the local educators and representatives on that. But I understand it's a tough situation, especially for our students with disabilities.
Yes.
Or otherly abled people, because I know that they're the ones who need the most one-on-one attention from multiple teachers and specialists throughout the day. A couple of our plaintiffs in the lawsuit, when we talked to them, told us that their children who have learning disabilities have had probably the most difficult thing they've had with the distance learning is the fact that they don't get to see as many teachers as they normally do. And they saw their students, their children, already suffering from, in terms of not making as quick progress as they were before, when they were able to see 3 or 4 different teachers. And the fact that you can have written materials in front of you for some of our students who have learning disabilities, but the materials being in front of them, the paper is not as good for them as for other students who don't have those learning issues. And they need the one-on-one teacher time of talking to them. And at least in the first several months of distance learning, that wasn't happening. Or the first couple of months of distance learning, that wasn't happening. It was maybe 1 or 2 teachers who would get to talk to them for a little bit, but not the more extended one-on-one work with them. But going to the, and I'll try to cover Kelly's question. So Kelly's question was, what were the specific changes that NM schools were required to make as a result of the Martinez and Yazi lawsuits? So that is an ongoing question. And I'll try to join that together with Diane's question to me. So just as a way of introduction for those of you who aren't so familiar with the Martinez and Yazi lawsuits, I can talk from the Martinez perspective that a number of educators and local community members in New Mexico were the ones who approached MALDEF in 2010, as early as 2010, 2011, and then in 2012 we began to really investigate issues of inequality, especially between Latino and non-Latino students, inequities there, but also between English learners and non-English learners. And upon investigation, we saw a lot of, and that would include not just Latino, but also Native American English learners and Asian American English learners. And those, though, what we learned is, in conjunction with what the Latino Education Task Force told us, was that not only was New Mexico unique in the problems it faced in terms of having so many English learners, having so many Latino students, and having many economically disadvantaged students, but also on the positive side, New Mexico had a state constitution and a history of state laws that gave us a lot of strong legal arguments to make in state court, about how Latino students, economically disadvantaged students, and English learner students needed to be provided an education. So, and an education that's as good as the education that other students who don't fall into those categories receive. And so when we look at racial equity, Diane's correct. We didn't bring a lawsuit that said Latinos are not being treated like non-Latinos, because we didn't think that would be the most compelling given New Mexico's law and constitution. But when we looked into the history of New Mexico's constitution, what we found was that the beginning of statehood from the beginning of statehood in New Mexico was founded against countervailing forces. And this is from our history expert in the case that we learned this. of racism in the United States. Senators, especially those from Arizona and some other states, did not want New Mexico to become a state because they said, too many Native Americans, too many Mexican descent people or Spanish descent people who are going to have to learn English or be assimilated for us to educate them and make them become a part of the United States and fit into the United States. And so as a part of that, when New Mexico's constitution was being drafted, and obviously I know we can debate the terminology here. And I know that nowadays we might not term it this way, but there were clauses in the New Mexico Constitution that are really unique to, I don't know of any other state that has these. Definitely not Texas, not California. Maybe, I don't know what California's would look like now. But New Mexico's Constitution says that children of Spanish descent, which we understand today to mean all Latino students, those who are indigenous and not, who are, from Latin America, all of Spanish descent are supposed to have the same, receive the same opportunities for education as non-Latino students. So that's the Spanish descent clause of the New Mexico Constitution. Perfect equality, that's what it says in there. Another important clause is, of course, providing a sufficient and uniform education to all students in New Mexico. So that does not just mean making it, as the state tried to argue in our lawsuit, making it kind of here's a textbook, here's a desk, that's all we have to provide. No, it's actually providing an education, and this is what the judge said, Judge Singleton, the late Judge Singleton, said in her opinion, and this is the theory that the Martinez plaintiffs asked for, is that a sufficient education under the New Mexico Constitution means an education that provides all students an opportunity to be prepared for college and career. That does not mean that, as the state tried to argue, well, we have some poor kids who are going to come in, or low-income kids who come into the school. That's way too hard. We're not going to be able to deal with that. We have Latino or Native American kids coming into the school. That's too hard. We're going to do our best, but if we can't pay for it and they're not going to have any chance at getting into college, it's not really our fault. That is literally the attitude. That is the attitude that was argued in court by the state's lawyers in our lawsuit at trial in 2017. That's already been 3 years. And so that is what our plaintiffs were up against. And so while we didn't have an exact, racial inequality argument, we did have an argument that was speaking to inequality faced by Latino, Native American, African American students via our claims, which were that we needed a sufficient education for all students. We needed an education, or the fact that economically disadvantaged students, so meaning low-income students, and English learner students were not receiving the same education as others. And we also claimed that students with disabilities were being denied due process by not receiving a sufficient education, which is a fundamental right under the New Mexico Constitution, which was never recognized before our lawsuit. But because of our lawsuit, now the court recognized that under the New Mexico Constitution, a sufficient education is a fundamental right. So those are that's kind of the big picture of trying to answer the questions about the lawsuits and also racial equity. I'll say one more thing because I know I've been going on for a couple of minutes, but another thing is that, and speaking to what Dean Burley was talking to us about, and I think what other people have talked to us about is students not seeing themselves in the texts, in their materials, in their curriculum. Something that we did not leave as some mere window dressing issue or something that's like an extra goodie that we think should be in there, or as the state called it, the kind of Cadillac or gold-plated version of education. No, we think it's part of education always, is multicultural education or culturally relevant curriculum and pedagogy. To answer Kelly's question, the state, and thank you to our elected representatives who got this part of this. We've started steps down that road of making sure that culturally relevant curriculum is developed in all of our districts and all of our schools, and that there is a framework for that. So that's still being developed. We're not quite there yet, but there are laws that the legislature has made a greater push to make sure that that happens. And I would ask the legislature not backtrack on that, because I know we're going to face some turbulent economic times in New Mexico, as many places will. So part of our establishing that there was that need for culturally relevant curriculum was our expert, Dr. Christine Sleeter, spoke on multicultural education at trial. And she said she did a study that was kind of a unique thing that we did, which was a study that showed that doing a survey of a bunch of widely used textbooks in New Mexico. And what there was that in these textbooks, even though we're in New Mexico, well, there definitely weren't African Americans depicted in prominent positive positions in our textbooks, whether that be math, science, and history. But there weren't even Latino or Native Americans portrayed in a positive light in our history or science or other texts that students were using. So that makes a difference. If a student doesn't see herself or himself or themselves in those materials, then they're not going to be as inspired to learn. They're not going to be as connected to the materials or feel like they have a stake in those materials. So I hope I've answered some questions that we could go on about it.
Definitely.
I'm actually,
there's so many pieces to that. You were going to say?
So the lawsuit is tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Sorry, I have so many things going on. But tomorrow morning at the Legislative Finance Committee, I think it'll be broadcast live, if not recorded.
Great.
The Legislative Finance Committee is holding hearings all morning tomorrow. And lawyers, I'm going to be speaking, and lawyers from the Yazi lawsuit are going to be speaking about what we think the legislature needs to do next. And the other piece of that is the state tried to file, and when I say the state, I mean the Public Education Department and its lawyers filed a motion to try to get rid of our judgment and our lawsuit. And we successfully, the court said that we're not done yet here. So that's the judge, Judge Wilson,
to go.
Judge Wilson said, yeah, we're not quite there yet. So I think it's important to keep in mind that this lawsuit is still ongoing in terms of we have the judgment, but now we're getting facts. We're going to work now with the Public Education Department to get information from them to see whether or what needs to be done, what more needs to be done. So I'll talk more.
Yes, that's wonderful.
If you want to hear more of the details of that tomorrow morning,
tomorrow,
you can
definitely.
tune into the LFC or listen to it later. Yeah.
Thank you, Ernest. That's very important information, and I really like the way you summarized it so well. I appreciate you so much. Of course, we adore you for all that you've done for us in New Mexico in this lawsuit and in other ways in terms of the other litigation you have going on as well. So thank you so much. I wanted to share that what the sources that we got for the Constitution came from a former attorney. I guess he's still an attorney, but he's an artist as well, Ray Montes, who lives in Santa Fe. And he had written an article in 1973 about the Spanish-speaking people of New Mexico. And the witness you were referring to was Felipe Gonzalez, who is now retired. But that was quite an experience of his lifetime as well. So thank you so much for that. I would also like to say that I apologize. I called Brian Colon, the treasurer, earlier. Our treasurer is Tim Eichenberg, and Brian Colon is our state auditor. So I just wanted to correct that. I had asked for Christian to be thinking about this question about how do we begin to fix systemic racism and oppression involving housing and education and transportation and property taxes. And I'm gonna ask you, Christian, you heard what Ernest said about students feeling represented in the curriculum. If any of that comes to mind in your response, feel free to use that. But what do you think we need to do, Christian, with our schools and with public education?
All right, thank you. I would think the first thing to do would be, we all have our personal biases and I guess a view of others, but as we've seen in a lot of the police incidents, I would say, some people are not really meant for the job to be a public servant. And I would go back to my experiences in high school, and I would agree that even some teachers and educators cannot fit that criteria because, especially in a school like Highland where I went to, it was very, very diverse. And I'm so proud of Highland being that way because we had a lot of immigrant children, we had a lot of refugees, we had many kids of different backgrounds and different areas of the city. And I would sometimes experience both sides of the spectrum, like some teachers would love each and every student in their own unique way, but then you'd also have those teachers where, because of their biases and because of the way they grew up, they tend to see different children in a different light, and sometimes even exclude them. And there's definitely a personal experience where I witnessed where this, I think it was a coach who, from what I saw, he did not like this girl, and she was African American, and I don't know for what reason, but he would like purposely exclude her. And I would see that, and I always felt that was wrong because how could someone with have that power and be put in this system have those views and morals,
Thank you so much for that, Christian. And those concrete examples really are meaningful. They are very important if we're going to be making changes as well. Thank you. Corkey, I'm wondering, do you have anything to add to that? We've just got a couple of minutes left, and I'm wondering your thoughts.
Yes, I do. One of the things that Dean Burley and Ernest mentioned was, the students being able to see themselves in the curriculum and to see themselves in the work they're doing. And in one of those areas where, because I teach Mexican American literature, we had to create a complete curriculum for me to offer that class. I offered it across the district and no one ever took me up on saying, hey, let me share with you. And so I'm looking at the curriculum APS uses right now for language arts, and 5 Mexican American writers are represented in a 4-year curriculum.
Oh my goodness.
And so those kind of things, right? And it's, it's very representative. It's very cross-cultural. There are Asian writers, there are African-American writers, there's writers from around the world. But in New Mexico, 5 Mexican-American writers, and in that, just excerpts from their material.
Wow, that's a shame, especially since we have so many prominent poets and writers. Our beloved Rodolfo Anaya just passed away, and we have writers all over the state. I can't wait for Christine Trujillo to write her autobiography, because I know that's going to be an exciting book. And I hope you do, Representative Trujillo. I seriously, as I'm saying this, you have such a rich life with all the work that you did with unions and all the different ways that you have contributed to our community. It would be wonderful. I want to interview you individually at some point. It's amazing, an amazing life. Ronaldo, we've just got a couple of minutes. I wonder if there's anything else you'd like to say. And then Manny, I know we need to wrap up, and I don't know if we get shut out at 7:30, but we need to talk about how important it is to vote and what's at stake in our communities. I know in my district 27, my rep is Marian Matthews, and she's done an amazing job. And her contender, the person against her, is a hardcore Trump supporter who was a former ICE agent. And that person can't possibly represent me and the children of our community. So, maybe you can inspire us at the end, Manny, with some information about voting. But I do want to get anyone's final comments, and I imagine Ronaldo, I think, has some. thing to share.
Final comments. I agree with Dr. Burley about, I think so many times in all of my classes with the race and social justice, I heard white students talk about, why are we in these classes when racism in itself is never going to end? Or are we blocked up to where we can't do anything? But I look at all of these structures. It's like a town or building. And if you look at a building of institutional, and you see policy over here, you see all of these structures and racism in amongst them. And I think so many times we often forget that just through ethnic studies and learning about who we are as people, that spiritual connection to who we are through our culture, through our language, helps us navigate the in-between spaces. Now, racism, we can identify it. We know if we can take the classes to say, oh, that's there, this is there. But if we ourselves identify with who we are, identify with our spiritual self through our language, through our culture, that's going to help us navigate in between the spaces so we don't stay stagnant in the racial issues, in the political issues, in the educational issues. Because I feel that we have to strategize on how to move through those spaces. And we have to identify those spaces, but we also have to be strong who we are spiritually to be able to see and foresight that movement and how we're going to do it. So I often feel that racism in itself won't go away, but I strategically will learn how to maneuver it. And
Wonderful.
That's my little quote.
I'm so glad this is recorded. I want to come back to that statement again. Thank you, Ronaldo, for your wisdom. Anyone else? Okay. Yes, Christian.
I'd like to talk real quick about the voting. And I think a big issue we have is my peers really do not believe in the system, because from what we saw in the 2016 election, democracy in itself, if we would go by that, the other opponent should have won, right? Because she had more votes, but because of what's it called again?
The Electoral College.
The Electoral College, yes. Because of that, we ended up with a different person as president. And many of my peers saw that and witnessed that, because we were at that age where we can start making these thoughts about what we feel and how we see these results. And many of the youth don't believe in the system. And I feel like that's a very challenging thing, because majority of us don't want to vote or just don't feel like our vote matters. And I feel that's an issue we should address definitely within our youth.
That's definitely a major issue. Awesome. And I'm glad you named it. It helps us as we're trying to recruit youth for voting. And in this next election, it helps us to know your thinking. And maybe we can reach out to you and maybe do some real critical thinking around how racism affects that system and how racism affects their vote, and why it's even more important that they vote because of that. So thank you, Christian. I will be reaching out to you for sure. We need your support.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
And with that, unless there's someone else, we have come to the end of our program. We have come to the end of our party. This was so exciting for me. I really, really enjoyed the conversation. I can't believe who I got on the same page at the same time on our Zoom call. It was just so exciting for me. And I hope that you all follow up with each other as well, because you are incredible leaders. And some of you are just meeting for the first time on this panel. And some of you have worked with each other for many years before. But I very much thank you for every single thing that you shared with us today. It is greatly valued. Thank you so much. Manny, can you cheer us on and give us some direction in the voting piece?
Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. I just also wanted to let you know that voting is a big part of it, and there are different ways that you can get involved. Right now, the Bernalillo County Clerk's Office is pleased to offer the online third-party registration agent training, which is going this summer. The training will be available through September 13th online.
Great.
So you can go actually online and take the voter registration agent course, and you can get certified, and you will be appointed by the Secretary of State into that position. Like I said, you have until September 13th. Specializing in voters in Bernalillo County, I have been working with the developmentally disabled population. I've also been using my Spanish degree that I have so I don't lose it. Just like, you know, it's just like all of us are just preaching everything that we want to be, which is the change that we need to see. And it's just awesome that New Mexico's in this landscape that we can actually be a part of this change. So I'm gonna go ahead and post this in the chat for everybody with the link on how to register voters. Basically, you can do this virtually. You can do it social distancing. There's ways to get around it, and there's some techniques in this training. So I'll go ahead and share that right now. And I just wanted, from the bottom of my heart, to thank everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you to our panel. Thank you for serving as the moderator, Diane. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to our leadership here in the Democratic Party of Bernalillo County for stepping up virtually.
Yes.
Your hard work is recognized, and it definitely is appreciated from all of you. Our state and our young people are better off because of you. I'm going to close with a quote and a call to action. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. And that quote is from Maya Angelou. After we end this virtual webinar, pick up your phone and call and email and contact your state legislators and urge them to continue to fight for young people of color and to support racial equity in our public education system. And I just want to say thank you all from the bottom of our heart for being here, and thank you for everything that you do to fight every day to make sure that our students across New Mexico are served. And education is an essential service. So thank you for all being here. And like
one last thing, if you don't mind, but please go ahead and finish.
I was just gonna say, just like Ernest said, we could talk about this for days.
Yes.
You know, this inequalities have been going on for decades, if not centuries. So thank you for being a part of bringing this to light. And as we progress with the public health orders and moving forward, we might have another education panel. So again, thank you all for being here, and we really appreciate it. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and let Diane finish.
I just wanted to thank our county chair of the Democratic Party, Flora Lucero. I want to make sure everyone knows who you are, because you're doing such a phenomenal job of organizing us and across the wards and across the county. Thank you so very much. And thank you for recognizing this as an issue from a conversation you and I had. This was one of the results, and I really appreciate that. I also want to thank our male vice chair. We have two vice chairs, a female and a male, and I want to thank Manny Crispin, who has been on top of this from the beginning and does great work organizing the racial equity panels. And I wanted to thank every one of the panelists. Dr. Vasquez had to leave to another meeting, and so she isn't ending with us on this call, but you can always reach out to her as well. Ivan, I want to thank you so much for the technical piece. This is probably the least technical issues I have had on a Zoom call like in weeks, and I so appreciate that very much. Dr. Herndon, thank you so much for your leadership always. You are our Secretary of the Democratic Party among so many other roles that you partake, and we are so proud of you. Thank you so very, very much. And of course, Ernest, for your work as our MALDEF attorney. Wow, the children of New Mexico have so much to be grateful for. Thank you so much.
For having me.
Ivan, I would like to ask if I could stay on with the panelists after you cut this down, or if we need to find a different way to meet separately. Would that be possible?
You can stay on as long as you like.
Okay, thank you so very much. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night. Thanks for joining us. Try to join us next month for our event. We'll be posting it on Facebook. And again, thank you. And get out the vote.